on
The
Facebook.
stupidest crime I've ever heard was when my parents were in Boston. Um, there was a guy who robbed a bank, but he wrote his ransom note on the back of one of his own checks, so they ransomed him back.
Oh,
Yeah.
At that point, you really just deserve to get arrested. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Theo Table, where angels dancing on the head of a pin can change your life. I'm Aiden, also known as Celtic Catholic Fire.
I'm Jarek.
I'm Maria.
and I'm Julie.
We are all current students or recent alumni of the University of Notre Dame and members of its theology club. Every week, the theology club has an event called Theo Table where we sit down and discuss a theological topic of interest over dinner, and this podcast has grown straight out of this model.
Our topic today is about how you use reason and faith to understand God. In the modern discourse, a lot of people talk about faith as if it is belief without proof, or sometimes even belief in the face of evidence to the otherwise.
However, plenty of philosophers and theologians, from Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages to Alan Plantinga today, have talked about proofs for God's existence. But is that a question we can really prove? And what does the church have to say?
Well, Vatican I effectively says yes. It says that we can demonstrate God's existence from our knowledge of science and natural reason, that is, like, philosophy. Um, yeah, but, like, I can. And I'm not exactly sure what the reasoning for this is.
But I mean, isn't there some scriptural verses that might tend one to believe the otherwise? For example, in the parable, not in the parable, but in the story of doubting Thomas, when Jesus appears in the upper room, I believe in John's gospel, where he says, "Blessed are those who have believed and not seen." So, isn't there some
Mm,
sort of virtue to believing things without proof?
yeah, that's true.
Well, okay, I'm gonna really weird and disjointed. Clean this up. Do with it what you will. But you know how older texts like St. Thomas Aquinas talks about philosophy as a type of science and theology
Mm,
as well as the highest science?
hmm.
And so when you talk about the Doubting Thomas passage from the gospel, it almost recalls kind of that ordering of the sciences, that the natural sciences are actually a body or a type of knowledge that's very intricate but lower than something like theological knowledge. In natural sciences, you know stuff by working with empirical evidence, right? And so Doubting Thomas believes when he touches the side of Christ and everything, and that proves it to him. It's a proof, like I don't know, something you would find in a lab. But Jesus says, what was it? Blessed are those who believe without having seen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
something like that.
So blessed are those who are able to believe and recognize the truth without going through that empirical stage. And to me, that kind of recalls, um, how theology is considered to be the highest philosophy, that you have knowledge given to you by reason and empirical evidence and stuff, but also knowledge from revelation.
Mm, yeah, that's possible.
Mm.
And also, like, even if Jesus says, like, blessed are those who see and do not, or rather, who believe and do not see, um, it doesn't mean that everything is based on. I mean, by that logic, if we're going to apply that to everything, we shouldn't try and understand anything except we should just take everything on pure faith, everything about religion. And that's not quite true. I mean, there are at least some religious claims that we think we can talk reasonably about and go through arguments about. And if we're going to apply that logic of the Gospel of John to everything, that would not be true.
Well, on what you were just saying, Jerk, I think there's two different questions there.
Mm,
One is, can you reason at all through claims about theology? And the other is much simpler. It's, can you prove God exists with reason?
mm, yeah.
Um,
I think talking to the first question, though, sort of drawing back to what Maria said about theology is the highest science. It's not just that we're taking things of theology on faith alone. because that's not really true. Theology isn't just this is what the church teaches and we believe all of this on faith. That's not how this works. Theology ultimately is a rational science. We draw from the truths of Revelation. We start from Revelation, but part of Revelation is that God made humans reasonable. God made
Mm,
our reason in the image of his own reason. So our reason can be trusted. And so we can reason about things. We can
to
reason
some
about
degree.
yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah, that's true. And like maybe it depends on how seriously we take our being formed in the image and likeness of God, and like to what degree are we formed in the image and likeness of God.
Right.
Um, St. Thomas, again, to go back to St. Thomas, he has this funny part where he's asking, is God a body? And one of the objections is, well, God made us in our image and likeness, and we are bodies, therefore God is a body. It's absurd and clearly, like, not true, because it's an objection which Thomas then completely dismantles. But, like, yeah, it just depends on how seriously we take us being formed in the image and likeness of God, and in what manner we're formed in the image and likeness of God. Is it just that our soul is in the image and likeness of God? And what capacities of our soul are in the image and likeness of God, to put it in like philosophical terms. And like sort of, but going off the part about reason being able to be trusted, I guess then people who are familiar with philosophy might say, okay, why don't all philosophers believe in God then? If reason can be trusted to this degree, and if Vatican I really is saying that we can know God through reason and science, why isn't there incontrovertible proof?
Well, there are proofs, and just because, and you can argue about some
Mm,
of the different proofs that are out there, but just because maybe we don't have the perfect proof yet doesn't mean one doesn't exist.
mm,
Well,
true. Yeah.
also, you say just because we don't have the perfect proof yet doesn't mean one doesn't exist. Eventually, at the end of the day, how is one supposed to judge whether or not one proof, like there are a myriad of different possible rational proofs for God's existence. Like Peter Kreeft has a nice web page where you go and it's just like 20 rational proofs for God's existence, and people react to those very differently.
You, you
But
know
is
it would be
Vatican
fantastic if you had a restaurant, like a Chinese restaurant, and instead of the fortune cookie with the little like "You'll have a great day," a rational proof for God. Boom.
Oh my goodness. That'd
no,
be one of the
Maria?
greatest forms of evangelization I can think of.
That would be a great project for some like Christian Chinese restaurant run by Chinese Christians. But for real, Maria, like people have different. You can try and like isolate the question of God's existence or theology from your emotions and presuppositions and desires all you want, but at the end of the day, that is very difficult, and people will react better to different flavors of argument. So, what Aiden was saying, like, we might not have the perfect argument yet, but like, does the church actually tell us that everyone will agree on the one? Like, are we chasing something that doesn't exist? Is there going to be one? It seems like something that might not exist.
Well, I think we can separate the idea of the argument being
Like,
perfect, like it's
yeah, like
logically
platonic.
sound. Yeah, we can separate it from being like perfectly logical from being something people would be like 100% on board with. Because if you take
Right.
like the again back to this great Chinese restaurant evangelization example, you can imagine someone has this giant like fortune cookie and they break it open and it's a scroll, and the scroll is just like one of Thomas Aquinas' proofs of the existence of God. It might be perfectly logical, but people aren't going to want to have their dessert interrupted by metaphysics.
Okay, it
True.
depends on the crowd you're catering to, but continue.
Yes. So I do think that's right. That even if a proof is perfect, that we know God exists based on this proof, it's 100% logical that it works. People aren't necessarily going to agree with it because actually, not Fulton J. C. Newman, Cardinal Newman. Cardinal Newman had a great thing on this, where his whole point was that people don't come to their beliefs based on logic. They come to their beliefs based on their own presuppositions about life,
Right.
about even morality sometimes.
Mm,
And our
Mm-hmm.
presuppositions are much stronger than our reason. So even if we have perfect reason, if it doesn't match with our presuppositions, the presuppositions and the essentially the emotions, the pre-existing
Right.
biases, they're going to win every time.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
mean, that's
So,
a
are
that's
we
a
just saying that
fascinating
everybody who doesn't
insight
believe in
into
God is
human
biased? And that
psychology,
seems
first
like
and
an
foremost.
unsatisfying conclusion.
It does. And one of the things, I don't actually believe this, but to kind of devil's advocate for that, so human beings go into something formed by emotional and situational presuppositions, whatever. So this means that we, in theory, have perfect reason that reflects kind of our being created in the image and likeness of God, but we can't actually access that on Earth. Is it a little too idealistic?
I don't think so, because I think that takes seriously the idea of us being fallen. I mean, like an Augustinian conception of our fallenness. Does that mean that this light of natural reason can't get us to the existence of God just because our reason is so fallen and so flawed that we just can't?
Well, if you're like an old school Lutheran, it does. Well,
Or even if you're like a really strong Augustinian,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I guess not universally would be the best answer to that.
Okay.
That like we could talk about some of the different proofs that are out there and why people like or dislike them, but there's lots of different ways people have tried to go about proving God, and I tend to think that some of them actually are perfectly logically sound, like Thomas Aquinas' ways, for example. We can go into those
mm,
in a minute, but just because something's logically sound, like, some people are going to see that, and
Right.
some people aren't going to see that, and if someone is able to separate themselves from their biases or their assumptions, then maybe they're able to essentially be open minded. If you're
Right.
approaching these proofs with an open mind, maybe they have more of an impact.
Right.
And I say that even for people who are Christians, who are believers. If you're not if coming into like logical arguments about God, trying to understand things better, if you have your conception of God and are going to stick with it no matter what the proof says, then you might say, oh, okay, well, it proves that God exists, without really thinking about what it says about God, because that's really the important thing, right? Talking about these
Yeah.
yeah,
proofs in terms of what they say about God.
hmm yeah, and maybe that's like where what Vatican One was saying might be applicable in some sense. Um, like it's not just like taking a theological claim and pushing it onto philosophy. It's saying like this is the sort of being that we believe God is. A being who is rationally determinable because he created us in his image and likeness with reason and all of that stuff. A being who is knowable through science because science is the study of his creation. Um,
See, now people might object to that. People might say, like, it's really common nowadays. The
yeah,
great atheists. You've got Dawkins and all that. Fine, all of those, the
great.
four horsemen,
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote great. Yeah, that would say science, as far as we can tell, says God doesn't exist. So, how would you say that God is scientific? Because the church does teach that God is, in some sense, corresponding to science.
Their arguments are just like I mean like I don't know if you want to get into like the messiness of what they actually say. Um, but as far
Briefly.
as I know, I don't know any philosopher who takes any of them seriously because their arguments just seem invalid at every turn, or they're just like Dawkins and Hitchens and Dennett and Harris.
Their
Like
arguments are invalid. You're saying.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, okay, so Jarek, so maybe serious philosophers don't take them for granted. And that's good news for us, I suppose. But what do you say to
yeah,
I don't even want to make up a number because it's probably too low. So we're going to say millions because that's too low. Millions
yeah,
of young people
totally.
out there who have just tasted a bit of science. They're in 10th grade. They're getting taught more advanced science than they have before. It's not rocket science yet, but their catechesis
Yeah,
ended in 6th grade. And Dawkins and Hitchens look like geniuses to them even if they're not
mm,
philosophically sound.
yeah.
Can you argue them into the faith? Can you not argue a person into the faith? Like, how do you answer the human problem, like happening on
Mm.
streets all over everywhere right now?
I don't know if it's so much arguing them into the faith, and I honestly think that Christian philosophers cannot approach
Hmm.
life trying to prove the faith,
Right.
or else that really does like reduce God and reduce the faith into just nothing more than just like
A
logical
logical
axioms, which it
proposition.
isn't.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Faith is mysterious, and faith is meant to be lived out in liturgy and prayer and in life. Um, but I think the best thing we can do is try and show that it's reasonable, because I think a lot of people have like problems with it. Just seems unreasonable. It just seems contrary to reason. It just seems irrational, and that only brainwashed people would believe it. But I think that the the strength in philosophy, the strength in Christian philosophy, is being able to show no, even if this doesn't demonstrate to you that we're right, it at least demonstrates to you that we're reasonable.
Right. Do you think it would be helpful to go into a bit of an overview about Kant, though? And, because
Mm,
the whole goal of Vatican I is to strike a balance between reason and faith, that you can't separate the two from each other. And in the modern age, I'm kind of reiterating what you're saying, but in the modern age, if you really focus on this kind of, I don't know, millennial sentiment that God and faith is irrational, and you try to combat it, and you make everything, you reduce God down to a logical proposition, you're kind of pulling a Kant, right?
yeah, and then yeah, I mean that's, and I don't think that that's what Vatican One is trying to do.
No.
I mean, I think Vatican One. I think you mentioned this earlier. That Vatican One is like trying to find the middle ground between the two extremes of like
Yeah.
one being hyper rationalism and one being hyper emotivism, anti
Right.
rationalism, as regards faith, anyway. Um, and I think that you're right that reducing God to being purely a function of reason would be going way too far.
In some sense, though, might we say that saying God is scientific, in other words, you can see God in the natural world, might help to alleviate the idea of him being purely irrational? Because it seems to me that
Mm,
the some of the better ways to see God as quote unquote scientific is to see him as the author of creation, capital A author, the creator. So in other words,
hmm
we can see his mark in everything that's made. I mean, if you want to get down to the really nitty gritty, like the strength of gravity, for example, or
Right.
things like that. If it was a little different, we couldn't have stars, we couldn't have atoms, we couldn't have
hmm
life in the universe. Everything seems to be fine tuned, for lack of a
Right.
better word, for
Yeah.
us, for life, for beings who can be made in the image of God and who can worship God.
So intelligent design.
Well,
To some degree.
not in terms of
Oh,
evolution. Not in terms of evolution. For the record, which pope was it that approved? Like said Catholics can believe evolution in good conscience, right?
I don't
Ben
remember.
Like
Benny the
the
16th, maybe?
mid 1800s.
Oh,
it was
18.
No,
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 before
no,
no.
it's
him.
like Pius the Tenth.
This is like the 1800s. It's like
I
mid
think it was like Pius the
1800s.
Tenth or Pius the Ninth or someone like that.
Yeah. So
Like
Catholics.
around the Vatican I period, somebody said Catholics can believe in evolution in full consciousness. And I think at this point, almost all Catholics do believe in evolution.
Well,
But that's not to say that we believe in like a Darwinian evolution that isn't. Well, because I think the problem that Catholics see is that the idea of evolution and the idea of God as author of the universe are not like mutually
no.
exclusive. You can believe both things, and a great majority of Catholics do believe both things.
And I mean Genesis, the creation story in Genesis, and I always found this really cool. Says that God told the earth to bring forth creatures. It's not the
Mm,
humankind is unique in that
yeah.
God shaped man from the ground. For all the rest of creation, he says, "Let the seas bring forth creatures. Let the earth bring forth creatures." It really does
Mm.
suggest God guiding a natural process like evolution to bring about his desired result.
Oh, that's so
I never
cool.
thought about that.
Yeah, that's true.
That's really cool.
Huh. Sweet. Yeah, and so that in that sense, God is. Although I'm still not fully hooked on what you said about God being scientific as a solution to God being over rationalized. What did you mean by that?
Okay, yeah, I mean, maybe I didn't explain myself as well as I could have. My sort of point with that was that you God as scientific more means God as creator, so looking at creation and seeing the mark of God.
Hmm.
And so what that does is it makes God personable. It makes him a person, a being who has
Got
done
it.
things and has will and intent, who
Hmm.
sees the universe and wanted it to be a place for us. In at
Mm.
least to some degree, like there could be other like Catholics are cool with aliens too. That's a thing. But if aliens exist, God might have intended parts of creation for them as well. We just don't know. But at the very least, around here, like the local solar system, it seems to be pretty like shaped by a creator for us. So,
Hmm.
so it serves as the foundation for making God relatable, personable, so to speak.
And that argument can go too far. Like,
Yeah.
so it's funny. There was a class in which we were studying like the extraterrestrial life debate, and like there were some people who were like, "Oh, God said in Genesis, let him make the sun in the sky for what was it? For signs and for times and for seasons and for years, something like that." Which implied to them that like God made the sun to keep time, and therefore because there were other stars, they have to be all these other aliens too out there, or because like what other function would they have? Would those stars have if there weren't other living beings there?
God's
Yeah,
literally
that's
a
the
divine
problem.
watchmaker. God literally is a divine
Jarek,
watchmaker building millions and billions of clocks.
Jarek, when I
People made this argument, and like John Adams in a private letter said, like, you know, the incarnation is incompatible with aliens, and we know aliens exist, therefore the incarnation can't have happened.
Jarek, when
No.
I did an
Yeah,
SSLP
Maria.
this summer after my freshman year, and I was in this tiny little town, 900 people in the middle of Utah, and there were the Mormons and the Catholic Church.
SSLP.
Yes.
Sorry, Maria. You might want to explain SSLP.
Oh, it's a summer service learning program through the university we all went to, where you're paid basically a scholarship to do a service program for 2 months. And so there were three churches: the Mormons, the Catholics, and this fundamentalist Baptist church, which said that aliens existed, but they were actually in the center of the earth and they were an enlightened form of being. And so God created them as something that you can like progress and develop into. So the holier you become, the more you
Huh.
emulate them, right? And
Okay.
then, like, your final goal in heaven is actually found in the center of the earth. I will send you. I'll send you the link to the website after the podcast is over. But this was a legitimate thing, and they would go door to door, and it was super impressive because they had more converts than the Mormons, who
Wow.
patent going door to door. It was amazing.
Oh
It
no.
was amazing.
Oh no.
Oh, Lord.
Wow.
So yeah, aliens.
So that would be an example of things being taken too far.
Yeah, right. Point in case.
Yeah. Yeah, so natural theology can go too far, but it is a valid form of reasoning about God. I think that's the conclusion out of all
Just
of
not
this.
in Utah.
Just not in Utah. Oh my gosh. Um. Yeah, I guess like one sort of fundamental question that we do have to ask, lest we sort of turn into like pedantic people in an ivory tower, is like, what does this at all have to do with our life as Christians? Does our ability to does the fact that God can be proved rationally through science and philosophy, does that do anything for us as Christians living our everyday life?
Well, it certainly is very, very useful. And a lot of modern Christians and Christians from throughout time can be very grateful for that because I know, at least this is true for myself, and I think it's true for a lot of younger Catholics today and Catholics today that weren't catechized so well. They argued themselves into the faith. Their introduction to the faith wasn't necessarily watching it lived, watching pious, like seeing holy people or being part of a Catholic culture. It was these rational arguments they found on the internet when they started looking into what the church teaches. But I was reading an article by a Dominican who studies at Notre Dame, Father Brophy, Justin Brophy, and he pointed out that like intellectual form of Catholicism can become problematic and exclusionary. Like you start to define the faith by doctrine and not by people, and the church by doctrine and not people trying to practice it. So, does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd almost wonder, going back to kind of Jarek's idea about, or his introduction of the idea that Vatican I was trying to find a balance between faith and reason. And then to your point, I was just wondering if you guys think it would be fair to say that a society or a group's understanding of God influences the way they understand human nature. That if a society says God is rational, then they're going to see human nature as something that's irrational, chaotic, and ultimately slide into nihilism. If they see God as something that's
Mm.
who's solely rational, then they're going to do the Kantian uber rational ethical type thing and completely miss out on a very rich faith. I don't know. Do you think that would be a fair thing to say?
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. I was at Seek 2017. I was at a talk by Scott Hahn where he talked about something like this, in terms of Christianity and Islam. Actually, that Islam, one of its big differences, aside from like the Trinity
Right.
and things like that, one of its big differences is it doesn't conceive of God as Father.
Yeah.
Hmm.
That it doesn't see God as a father figure. It sees him as a lord, as in some sense merciful, but not as father, and in fact has deep problems with calling God father because that's not how they see God. So, in other words, it's the language we use and the terms we use about God really matter because ultimately we're trying to live out a relationship with God, right? We're trying to live out our faith and to worship and live with and strive towards the life of our Lord. And to do that, we have to know who our Lord and our God is. And so, knowing God as a father, someone who, like in the parable of the prodigal son, will always be ready to forgive if you repent, is very different than seeing God as a Lord who only has justice and does not have the mercy of a father towards his children.
Mm. And I think to bring this over to to directly apply the whole God being rational sort of thing, I think if we conceive of God as totally irrational, then we think that there's no way for us to know Him
Yeah.
in some. There's a sense in which we can't get to know Him except through more sort of subjective, emotivist means. Like, and then in that sense, if we can't get to know Him except by our subjective experience, then we sort of fall into individualistic sort of. I think, in my opinion, there's no way of talking about God solely based on your own emotions and not reducing Him to just creating God in your own image in that sense.
Yeah, yeah.
And if
The
God is something objective and something rational, in that sense, you can have multiple people who can all be striving towards the same God and reach some common conception of God. All of a sudden, your faith life, your life of your relationship with God becomes a communal affair and not just an individual one. Which I think to Catholics who believe in the church is really important.
I think that's I think
yeah.
that's something. Oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead, Brit.
That's something that's really cool and special about the Catholic Church because we have famous Protestant philosophers like Kierkegaard and what was his name, Georg Hamann, who said that your experience of faith is not something that can be directly shared. But a Catholic can say your individual experience of faith and relationship with God cannot be directly shared in that way. They'd agree because you often reduce it to, emotions and making God in your own image. So we have that, and it's intensely personal and individual, but we also have the sacraments and a common source of grace and coming to know God, which we all experience together. So we have language and framework with which to discuss this in. If if that didn't make
Exactly,
sense, you can
exactly.
cut it. But
No, no, no.
No,
You're
that
absolutely.
made perfect sense.
Yeah, that God is, and God desires to be
you're
worshipped
right.
communally. God desires to be known as a community. That, like the Book
Yeah.
of Revelations talks about, the end of history. The best thing in all of human history is going to be when the church, as a unity, as a community, enters into the eternal
Right.
marriage with God, with Christ.
Yeah.
The
I mean, God made covenants in Israel with not just people like Abraham and Isaac, but also with bodies. He made a covenant with
Right.
the people of Israel. He made a
i.e., like
covenant
bodies of
Yeah.
through
people,
Christ with his
not,
church.
not
Yeah,
like.
exactly. Yeah. And Paul talks about the church
Right.
as the body of Christ so much that it's almost like impossible for us to read Paul and think of faith as a
Right.
purely individual thing.
Right, right. Which is why it's, I don't know about disappointing is not the right word, but just kind of so many people tend to think of their relationship with God as their own personal thing, and they don't need to go to church. They don't need to go to any denomination because it's my relationship with God. Why should I need
I
to?
can pray in my house. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. Whereas but it's not just that. That God isn't just someone you relate to. He's also someone you know reasonably, rationally, and in that way can approach as a community who all have the same foundational understanding of what it means to be related to God. To use the
Mm.
phrase of a very popular priest and teacher around Notre Dame's campus, related in love. That is, that the way we relate to God in love is as a community through the sacraments, through the Eucharist, Mass, confession. All of that requires a common understanding of who God is and what his being is.
Yeah. And not just a common understanding, but even just the belief that we can have a common understanding.
Oh, exactly, exactly. I think then, if anyone else has any
Um,
other thoughts?
Is there anything that we missed
do
that we
you
should
do you
go
think
back
we
and
should
cover?
give brief summaries of Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God and Thomas's five ways? Because we mentioned both, I think.
Um,
The ontological argument came up in the
Oh, okay.
previous test run.
I don't think we need to summarize them. I think just like describing them is. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think we should, because that can get a
Yeah.
little bit too like
do we
That's
know
another
detailed
20
what
if
we're
we
minutes.
at
start summarizing
time
them.
wise?
We're at about
Okay.
half an hour.
That's pretty good. How would we? I think unless anyone has any burning thoughts, like that's a good time,
Yeah,
and it
yeah.
That
ended
is a good time.
organically.
We can start
So
wrapping
don't
Mhm.
up.
stab it and
Yes,
try
yeah.
and DNR
Well-
DNR the podcast.
Okay. Well, how about this? For all you listening at home, here's your homework if you want homework. There are actually proofs of the existence of God. We kind of mention them but don't go over them. So if you're interested, St. Thomas Aquinas' Five Ways are a place to start, as is St. Anselm's ontological argument. So if you're interested in actually reading proofs for the existence of God, that's where I'd start looking things up.
And also know that there's a lot of like people have a lot of thoughts on these proofs, a lot of thoughts on these proofs, why they're invalid, why they are in fact valid instead of you can spend a long time studying. You can probably spend a lifetime studying these proofs, and people have spent lifetimes studying these proofs. But if you do want also a more complicated, more complex sort of evaluation of different types of proofs for God, the philosopher Edward Vaser has this great book called Five Proofs for the Existence of God or something like that, which goes through 5 different historical approaches to proving God's existence. And that one I've heard is also a really, really good book if you're interested.
There you go.
Excellent.
Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Before you leave, please pray with us the prayer of St. Thomas Aquinas. Grant us, O Lord, minds to know you, hearts to seek you, wisdom to find you, conduct pleasing to you, faithful perseverance in waiting for you, and a hope of finally embracing you. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. And that's the podcast.